Just before midnight, Sheriff Mason Reed flipped on his patrol lights behind a battered sedan on Highway 17, all because of a broken taillight. The driver was a single mother named Grace Bennett, still in scrubs after a night shift, her hands trembling as she rolled down the window. But it wasn't her paperwork that put Mason on edge. A weak moan rose from the back seat. He raised his flashlight and froze. Beneath a blood-stained blanket lay Deputy Amelia Carter, missing over a day. As Mason drew his weapon, Grace said, "If you call the wrong person, she dies." Stay with this story to find out whether Grace is truly saving a deputy or walking straight toward a killer. At 11:57 that night, Highway 17 outside Pine Hollow was almost empty. Grace Bennett drove her aging sedan home after a shift that had run long, her eyes heavy, her mind already on the quiet house waiting for her. The car's right taillight had shattered sometime in the last hour, and a fresh scrape marked the rear panel, though Grace herself had barely noticed either. Mason spotted the car moving at an odd, uneven speed and flipped on his lights out of habit more than suspicion. Grace didn't run. She didn't even flinch. She simply took a few extra seconds to bring the sedan to a stop and roll down her window, and in those seconds Mason read everything he needed to read. Her face had gone pale under the streetlight. There was a dark smear on her sleeve that didn't look like anything a nurse would pick up on a normal shift. Her eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror instead of to him. Mason asked, evenly, whether she'd had anything to drink, or whether she'd been in some kind of accident. Grace only answered that she needed to get to a hospital, her voice tight and clipped in a way that told him she was holding something back by sheer force of will. Then a low moan rose from behind her, muffled, human, unmistakable, and Mason's hand moved to his sidearm before he'd even decided to move it. He raised his flashlight and swept it across the back seat, and the beam landed on a woman he recognized instantly, even bruised and half-conscious under a blood-stained blanket. It was Deputy Amelia Carter, missing from Pine Hollow for more than a full day, her forehead cut, her wrist ringed with dark bruising, her uniform torn at the collar, her service weapon nowhere in sight. For one long moment, Mason was certain Grace had done this to her. He nearly said as much, but Grace didn't argue and didn't reach for anything. Instead, she asked him, almost sharply, to check whether Amelia was still breathing before he did anything else. She told him, quickly now, that she'd found Amelia along an abandoned logging road roughly 25 minutes earlier, half in a ditch, barely conscious, and that she'd been driving straight for help when he pulled her over. She said she'd meant to call for an ambulance the moment she reached cell coverage. Then Amelia stirred, her fingers closing hard around Grace's wrist, and she whispered two words that changed the shape of the entire night. "Don't call dispatch." Mason went cold, because dispatch was his own department's lifeline, the one system he trusted without question. Amelia's eyes opened just enough to find him, and with what strength she had left, she managed a warning that would not leave him for the rest of that week. "Not everyone," she said, "but someone inside." Then her eyes closed again, and she was gone from him, unconscious, leaving Mason standing on the shoulder of an empty highway with a wounded deputy in his back seat and a badge he could no longer be sure of. He did not reach for his radio. Instead, almost without thinking, he reached into his own cruiser and switched off the dash camera that fed straight back to the station. He turned to Grace, who was watching him with a wariness that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with what she'd just survived on that dark road. From now on, he told her, "Don't trust any badge except the one standing in front of you." Mason made a choice in those first minutes that would define everything after it. Instead of driving Amelia to Pine Hollow General, where every nurse and orderly answered to people he could no longer vouch for, he took her to a small emergency clinic in the next county over. He called Elizabeth Moore, the district attorney, and asked her to meet them there, not as a courtesy but so that whatever evidence came out of that night would exist outside his own department's chain of custody. Doctors confirmed a concussion, a cracked rib, and dehydration severe enough to suggest Amelia had been kept somewhere without water for longer than a few hours. There was no gunshot wound, no knife wound, nothing that suggested her captors had wanted her dead on the spot. Whoever had taken her seemed to want her gone, not necessarily gone forever, at least not yet. While Amelia was stabilized, Mason took Grace into a side room and asked her to walk him through the entire night again, slowly this time. She told him she'd left the rehabilitation center just before 11, and that she'd taken a back route home because part of the main highway was closed for repaving. She'd seen a flash of reflective fabric down in the ditch and assumed at first that there'd been a car accident. Instead, she found Amelia crawling out of the tree line, barely able to speak, repeating one clear sentence over and over. If they hear my name on the radio, they'll come back. Grace had gotten her into the sedan without a second thought. Not long after, a black SUV appeared behind them, and Grace didn't wait to find out who was driving it. She turned onto a side road, and the SUV clipped the rear corner of her sedan as it tried to force her off the pavement, shattering the taillight that had first caught Mason's attention. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the SUV was gone, and Grace had no idea why. Mason checked her phone while she talked and found nothing: no contact with Amelia, no suspicious calls, and a work schedule that confirmed she really had just come off shift. Slowly, carefully, he let himself believe her. One detail stopped him cold. Grace remembered the SUV's plate, or at least the last three characters she'd caught in her mirror. 714. Mason knew that combination. It matched an unmarked SUV assigned to his department's Special Investigations Unit, a vehicle under the direct control of Chief Deputy Connor Hayes. The man Mason had trusted without question for more than a decade, the man who had trained him, covered for him, stood beside him at his wife's funeral. For the first time all night, Mason felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with fear for Amelia and everything to do with the ground opening up beneath his own department. The man he trusted most in Pine Hollow had just become his first real suspect. To understand what had happened to Amelia, the story had to go back 36 hours, to the quiet stretch of days before anyone realized she was missing. As the deputy responsible for the evidence room, Amelia had spent the better part of 3 months noticing small things that didn't add up. Cash logged from seizures came up short by amounts too specific to be careless error. Certain evidence bags had been relabeled with codes that didn't match the original intake sheets. The evidence room's camera suffered a strange run of technical failures, always on the same handful of nights each month. At first she told herself it was simple mismanagement, the kind every department dealt with sooner or later. Then one arrest changed her mind entirely. A man had been charged with drug possession, but the dash camera from the arresting cruiser showed the contraband found in a completely different location than the one described in the official report. Amelia pulled the file metadata herself and found that a segment of footage had been deleted outright. Only one person had accessed the system that night, and his name was Connor. She didn't go to Mason with it, not yet, afraid of accusing the wrong man on the strength of a single inconsistency. Instead, she quietly began copying everything herself: inventory reports, access logs, GPS data from department vehicles, building a case in private before she trusted it to anyone else. She arranged a meeting outside town with a witness she believed could corroborate what she'd found: Lucas Warren, the mechanic who serviced most of the department's fleet. Lucas had once been asked to repair an unmarked SUV after what he'd been told was a collision with a deer, but the paint transferred onto the front bumper had come from a civilian sedan, not a deer, and not the guardrail the report described. That same evening, after their meeting, Amelia disappeared. When Mason asked about it the next morning, Connor suggested she might be dealing with something personal and recommended waiting 24 hours before launching a full search. Mason, trusting him completely, had agreed. Now, replaying that conversation in his mind, Mason understood that those 24 hours had bought her captors exactly the head start they needed. He went back to the station that day pretending he knew nothing, and Connor asked, almost casually, about the sedan he'd pulled over the night before. Mason lied without hesitation, calling it nothing more than a nurse with a broken taillight. Connor smiled and said he'd hoped Mason had found something more interesting than that. Mason gave no reaction, but something in the timing bothered him. Connor had known about the stop faster than any normal process should have allowed. When Mason quietly pulled the system logs later that night, he found the proof. Connor had accessed his cruiser's camera feed remotely, just 2 minutes after he'd pulled Grace over on the shoulder of Highway 17. Mason wanted Grace to keep living her normal life for a few more days, at least the surface, so that whoever was behind Amelia's abduction wouldn't sense that anything had changed. Grace agreed, reluctantly, though her mind kept circling back to her daughter. Her greatest fear wasn't for herself. It was that if this situation spread any further, Madison could somehow be pulled into danger simply by being her child. For safety, Madison stayed with relatives for the length of what followed, tucked far away from the unfolding investigation, appearing only at the edges of the story rather than inside it. It didn't take long for the surface calm to crack. Grace noticed a car parked across from her house for hours at a stretch, and by the time Mason arrived to check, it was already gone. At the clinic, a man claiming to be a county officer came asking pointed questions about her, though no one in the county had actually sent him. Mason understood immediately that Grace had been identified. He moved her to a cabin that belonged to his family, tucked well off the main roads, and Grace's patience finally broke. Less than a day earlier, she had been nothing more than a nurse driving home after a long shift. Now she was being forced to take leave from her job because of a conspiracy she barely understood. Mason apologized for having suspected her at the traffic stop. She told him flatly that he'd only done what any decent officer would have done. Her real problem was that she had no idea which of the others in his department she could trust. It was a small moment, but it marked a shift in how Mason saw her. She was no longer just a witness to be protected. She was someone with her own steadiness, her own judgment, someone who had held her ground through a night that would have broken most people. Amelia woke again that same evening, though her memory of the abduction itself came back only in broken pieces. She remembered being struck from behind, being dragged into an SUV, and hearing two voices talking above her. One of them had referred to the other only as Chief. Mason asked whether it could have been Connor's voice specifically. Amelia wasn't certain. She'd been blindfolded the entire time and could only guess at who had spoken. What she was certain of was that before she'd been taken, she had hidden a copy of everything she'd gathered somewhere her captors would never think to search. Not on a flash drive, not in her apartment, not anywhere obvious. She had hidden it inside the one place no one would look twice. Her own patrol cruiser, the one that had just been sent out for repairs. And that cruiser was sitting at that very moment inside Lucas Warren's garage. Mason and Grace drove out to see Lucas together, quietly, off the record. Grace came along because she was the only one who could positively identify the SUV that had chased her down the back road. The moment Lucas heard Amelia's name, his composure slipped. He admitted, almost before they'd finished asking, that the patrol cruiser supposedly sent to him for repairs had never actually arrived. Someone from the department had intercepted it first. The paperwork authorizing that transfer carried Connor's signature. Lucas still had photographs from an earlier repair job showing the SUV with the plate ending in 714, and Grace confirmed at once that it was the same vehicle that had run her off the road. The evidence against Connor was mounting quickly, but Mason couldn't shake one piece that didn't fit. If Connor had wanted Amelia dead, why keep her alive for more than a full day? And if she was being held that carefully, how had she managed to escape at all? Piecing together what they knew, they realized her captors weren't hunting Amelia herself so much as something she had taken. Not financial records, but footage proving that a major arrest had been deliberately staged. If that recording ever surfaced, it could unravel dozens of convictions, trigger a federal review of the department, and collapse a protection scheme that had clearly been running for years. Lucas remembered one thing Amelia had told him before she vanished. Almost in passing, if she didn't come back, he should check the place no one looks while the car is moving. Mason immediately thought of the data recorder mounted beneath the driver's seat. But the cruiser itself was gone. Grace remembered another detail from the chase, a fresh inspection sticker on the SUV's windshield, one Lucas recognized instantly as coming from only one place in the county, an old maintenance yard on the north edge of town. Mason prepared to head there. Grace wanted to stay behind, and for a moment it looked like the safer plan. But as they turned to leave the garage, they found the back door standing open. Lucas was nowhere in sight. On the floor of the workshop lay only his shattered phone and a thin trail of blood leading toward the open door behind it. Mason crouched beside the phone without touching it, studying the spiderweb crack across its screen, the faint smear of a boot print near the threshold. There had been no shouting, no struggle loud enough to draw the neighboring shops, which told him whoever had taken Lucas had done it fast and had done it before, the kind of practiced quiet that came from experience rather than panic. Grace stood very still near the workbench, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the blood trail the way she might watch a patient's vitals dropping, cataloging it, refusing to let herself fall apart before there was time for that later. She said Lucas hadn't seemed like a man who scared easily, not from what she'd seen of him only minutes earlier, and that whoever had pulled him out that door must have known exactly when to come. Mason radioed no one. He called Elizabeth directly on her personal line instead, describing the scene in careful, clipped sentences, aware that every second they spent standing in that garage was a second further from wherever Lucas was being taken. Grace picked up a spare rag from the workbench, folded it without thinking, and pressed it into Mason's hand for the cut already forming along his knuckles from where he'd braced himself against the door frame. It was a small, almost absent gesture, but it told him something about her that the last 2 days already had. She noticed what needed fixing, and she fixed it, whether or not anyone asked her to. Mason had no choice now but to bring Elizabeth fully into the situation. She urged him to call the state police, and he agreed, on the condition that they avoid Pine Hollow's own communication system entirely until they understood who inside it could be trusted. Together they drove out to the old maintenance yard on the north edge of town. Lucas wasn't there. But Amelia's patrol cruiser was, its interior stripped almost bare, panels pried loose, wiring exposed where someone had clearly searched it in a hurry. Mason checked beneath the driver's seat first and found nothing. It was Grace who noticed the fresh stitching along the seam of the headrest, a repair too neat and too recent to belong to any factory upholstery. Inside it was a memory card. Amelia had planted a false lead about the moving car deliberately, Mason realized, a decoy in case she was ever forced to talk under pressure. The real card held raw, unedited footage, financial logs, and audio recorded from inside the evidence room itself. One recording captured Connor speaking to someone else entirely, and what it revealed upended everything Mason thought he understood. Connor wasn't the man running the operation. He was being coerced into it. The true architect of the scheme was a county-level investigator who had used Connor for years to control evidence and manufacture false arrests. That didn't erase Connor's guilt. He had taken money, helped cover the tracks, and played a direct role in Amelia's abduction. But he hadn't given the order to kill her. That order had come from someone above him, someone whose name Mason still hadn't heard when the lights in the yard suddenly went dark. A gunshot shattered the window nearest them, and Mason pulled Grace down behind the frame of the stripped cruiser before either of them had time to think. In the chaos, Grace used what she knew from years of emergency work to steady a gash along Mason's forearm while they searched for a way out through the rear of the repair bay. State police arrived soon after, but whoever had fired on them had already slipped away into the dark. What unsettled Mason most wasn't the ambush itself, it was the timing. Only 4 people had known where they were headed that night: himself, Grace, Elizabeth, and Amelia. And as he stood in the wreckage of the maintenance yard, a message came through confirming that Amelia's hospital phone had just been used to send someone their exact location. He stared at the notification for a long moment, feeling something cold settle low in his chest because every possibility that message opened up was worse than the one before it. Either Amelia's phone had been stolen from her hospital room without anyone noticing, which meant the people hunting them had reached inside a building he'd trusted to be safe, or somehow the message had come from Amelia herself, which was a thought he refused to let take root until he had proof one way or the other. Grace watched his face change as he read it, and didn't ask what it said. She had learned enough about him over the last 2 days to know that some silences needed to be respected rather than filled. Elizabeth, standing a few feet away with the state troopers, caught his eye and gave a small, grim nod. She'd seen the same alert. Whatever came next, the 4 of them who had trusted each other completely only hours earlier now had to reckon with the possibility that trust itself had been the vulnerability all along. Mason raced back to the clinic where Amelia had been staying, his pulse still not fully settled from the ambush. She was still in her bed, still recovering, but her phone was gone. Security footage showed someone in medical scrubs entering her room for only a few minutes, long enough to take what they needed and disappear again before anyone thought to question them. Amelia confessed to another secret she'd been carrying since before her abduction. She had reached out to Connor directly, giving him a quiet chance to come forward on his own before things went any further. Frightened, Connor had agreed to meet her. But the meeting turned out to be a trap set by the people watching him. The network had been tracking his movements for weeks. Connor had gone along with the plan to take Amelia, convincing himself that handing her over would protect his family and keep his own corruption buried. It was only when he realized the network intended to kill her that something in him broke, and he quietly loosened her restraints when no one else was watching. That single act of conscience was the only reason Amelia had made it out of the woods alive at all. Mason sat with that contradiction for a long moment, unable to fully condemn or forgive it. Connor had been a fixture in his life for over a decade, the man who'd trained him as a rookie, who'd stood beside him through his wife's funeral without ever needing to be asked. But loyalty like that couldn't erase what Connor had done, and Mason knew it. Then Connor called him directly. He was holding Lucas at an abandoned quarry outside town, and he offered a trade, Lucas's safety in exchange for the memory card. Mason understood this might be his only real chance to end things cleanly. Grace insisted on coming along, not to fight, but because she alone had seen the back road well enough to identify the quarry's secondary entrance from the night she'd first found Amelia. Mason resisted at first, but her knowledge of the terrain was too valuable to leave behind, and her role, as before, stayed that of a witness and a guide rather than anyone stepping into the line of fire. Elizabeth coordinated a perimeter with the state troopers while Mason drove out alone to the meeting point. Connor was waiting when he arrived, and Lucas was alive beside him, shaken but breathing. Connor admitted that he too was being hunted now. After the failed attempt to recapture Amelia, the network had decided he'd become a liability they could no longer afford to keep alive. "I didn't call you here to save myself," he told Mason. "I called you here to end this." A single gunshot rang out from the ridge above them before either man could say another word. Mason dropped instantly, pulling Lucas down with him behind the rusted frame of an old loader, his ears ringing with the echo bouncing off the quarry walls. Connor hit the ground a half-second later, cursing under his breath, already scanning the tree line for the muzzle flash he knew was coming. For a moment none of them moved, waiting to see whether the shot had been a warning or the opening move of something worse. Grace, watching from the perimeter with Elizabeth, felt her stomach drop at the sound, every instinct telling her to run toward it rather than away, the same instinct that had pulled Amelia out of a ditch 2 nights earlier. Elizabeth's hand closed firmly around her arm, holding her in place, reminding her in a low voice that the troopers were already moving in. Grace forced herself to stay still, counting her own breaths the way she counted a patient's pulse, waiting for a signal that never seemed to come fast enough. Down in the quarry, Connor turned to Mason with an expression that had nothing left to hide behind. "Whatever happened next," he said quietly, he wanted it on record that he'd tried to fix at least one thing before the end. Mason didn't answer. He was already calculating the distance to cover, the angle of the ridge, and how many minutes it would take for backup to close the gap between promise and rescue. The ambush unfolded fast once the first shot broke the silence. Mason pulled Lucas into cover behind a stack of concrete barriers while Connor, wounded but still functioning, called out the positions of the remaining shooters from memory, having spent the last several hours as their prisoner, and learning more about their layout than he probably should have admitted to knowing. State troopers advanced from the opposite ridge, moving in coordinated pairs through the scrub brush. Grace stayed back in the safe zone with Elizabeth, exactly where she needed to be, and when Lucas was finally brought out to the perimeter, bleeding from a shallow cut along his temple, she was the one who knelt beside him and steadied his breathing until the paramedics arrived. It kept her essential to the story without pushing her into a role that never fit her. She wasn't a fighter, and the script never asked her to pretend to be one. At the center of the quarry, Mason finally came face to face with the man who had built the entire operation from the shadows. He tried to reason with Mason the way men like him always did, arguing that exposing the files would gut the department's credibility, reopen dozens of settled cases, and leave Mason presiding over a force he could no longer fully control. Mason answered simply that a badge meant nothing if it had to be protected with lies. What the man didn't know was that a small recorder on Mason's chest had been transmitting the entire exchange back to Elizabeth from the moment he arrived. The trap had quietly turned itself inside out. State troopers closed in and took the remaining conspirators into custody. Connor surrendered without resistance, holding out his wrists for Mason to cuff himself rather than leave it to anyone else. There was no triumph in it for Mason, no satisfaction in watching a man he'd once called a friend brought down this way. Connor asked, quietly, whether Mason could tell people he'd tried to make it right at the end. Mason told him he would tell the whole truth, the good parts and the bad ones both, and Connor accepted that answer without arguing, the closest thing to peace either of them was going to get that night. It was an ending built on something more honest than pure villainy undone, a man who had done real harm and who had also, in his final hours, chosen to do one decent thing. Lucas was safe. The copied files were handed directly to the state police and to Elizabeth, out of reach of anyone still inside the department who might have wanted them to disappear. What had begun in the back seat of an old sedan on a quiet stretch of highway now had the power to shake the entire town of Pine Hollow to its foundation. As the last of the troopers cleared the quarry, Mason walked back toward the vehicles alone, still feeling the weight of the recorder against his chest, still hearing Connor's voice asking whether the truth could be told gently. He didn't have an answer for that yet. He only knew that morning was still hours away, and that when it came, Pine Hollow would wake up to a version of itself it hadn't expected to face. Grace met him at the edge of the perimeter, her hands still faintly stained from tending to Lucas, her eyes searching Mason's face for some sign of how badly the night had gone. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. She fell into step beside him without a word, and for the first time since the taillight had flickered in his headlights, the silence between them felt less like suspicion and more like something closer to trust. Weeks passed before Pine Hollow began to settle into its new shape. Several officers were suspended pending investigation. Connor pleaded to a long list of charges, including obstruction, evidence tampering, unlawful detention, and conspiracy. The fact that he had ultimately helped Amelia escape and cooperated once caught was noted by prosecutors, but it did nothing to erase the weight of what he'd taken part in. Amelia recovered steadily, returning to the department as a witness first, not yet cleared for active duty. Lucas was placed under protection while investigators worked through the fallout. Every case touched by tampered evidence was reopened for independent review, a process that would take months to complete, but that no one in the department tried to slow down. Mason called a press conference, rather than let the story trickle out in fragments that others could shape to their advantage. He didn't soften what had happened to protect the department's reputation. He stood in front of the cameras and admitted plainly that he'd trusted Connor for far too long without asking the right questions. It cost him some of the polish that came with being seen as an untouchable lawman, but it earned him something more durable, a reputation as a man willing to correct his own mistakes rather than bury them. Grace went back to her work at the rehabilitation center, keeping her distance from the attention that followed. When reporters started calling her the woman who saved Deputy Carter, she brushed the label aside every time it came up, telling them simply that she'd seen someone hurt and done what she hoped anyone would do for her in the same position. Whatever was growing between Grace and Mason took its time, the way real things tend to. There was no sudden declaration, no rush toward anything neither of them was ready for. Mason found himself stopping by the rehabilitation center more often than any ongoing case truly required, and Grace eventually teased him about it, pointing out that the investigation had technically closed weeks earlier. He admitted, a little sheepishly, that he supposed he'd run out of official reasons. It was the first real crack in the careful distance both of them had kept since that night on the highway, the first hint that something quieter and warmer had been building underneath all the danger. One afternoon he showed up with tools in hand and fixed the very taillight that had started it all. Grace looked at the car for a long moment and told him it was strange to think that if it had never broken, he never would have pulled her over. Mason looked back at her and said that if it hadn't broken, the two of them might have missed out on a great deal more than just one case. Grace laughed at that, a real laugh, the first one Mason had heard from her since the night everything began, and something about the sound of it settled a part of him that had stayed tense for weeks. She handed him a glass of water and sat down on the porch steps beside the car, watching him tighten the last bolt with the careful patience of a man who no longer had anywhere else he needed to be. He talked, a little, about the department's slow rebuilding, about the officers who had chosen to stay and do the harder work of restoring trust rather than walk away from the mess. Grace listened without offering easy comfort, the same way she listened to patients who needed honesty more than reassurance, and Mason found he appreciated that about her more than he could easily put into words. When he finally stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, the taillight glowed steady red in the fading afternoon light, and neither of them mentioned the case again for the rest of the evening. 6 months later, the Pine Hollow department looked different from the inside out. A new independent system governed how evidence was logged and reviewed, built specifically so that no single person could quietly control it the way Connor once had. Amelia returned to full duty, choosing to lead the reform of that very process herself, determined that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else wearing the same uniform. Mason was asked to run for another term as sheriff, and he agreed only after the new oversight measures were formally adopted, unwilling to lead a department that still depended on blind trust in any one man. Grace's life, by comparison, had quieted considerably. Madison appeared again only briefly near the end of it all, safely removed from the danger that had defined those tense weeks, never used as leverage, never placed anywhere near the investigation itself. One evening, Mason arrived at Grace's house in his own truck instead of his patrol cruiser, and Grace watched him pull up from the window with a small, knowing smile. No flashing lights this time, she called out as he walked up the path. He told her that tonight he had no plans to pull anyone over. He simply asked her to dinner. It wasn't a grand gesture. There was no proposal, no rushed declaration meant to tie up every loose thread by nightfall. It was the quiet, deliberate beginning of something neither of them was interested in rushing, not after everything they'd already survived to reach this point. Around that same time, Amelia sent Grace a short note of thanks, just a single line that Grace read more than once before tucking it away. "You didn't know who I was when you stopped, and that's exactly how I know who you are." Grace kept that note in the glove compartment of her sedan, the same car that had once carried a wounded stranger down a dark highway. The vehicle had long since been repaired, a new taillight installed, gleaming and whole, though a faint trace of the old scrape along the rear panel remained, and Grace never bothered to have it buffed away completely. It felt less like damage now and more like a small private reminder of the night that had rearranged everything that came after it. Later that same week, Mason and Grace drove together down the same stretch of road where she'd first found Amelia in the ditch. There were no sirens this time, no black SUV trailing behind them in the dark. Just a quiet road under a wide evening sky, and two people who had earned, at last, the simple relief of driving down it without looking over their shoulders. Mason slowed the truck near the spot where the ditch curved off toward the tree line, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Grace looked out at the grass swaying along the shoulder, remembering how loud her own heartbeat had sounded that night, how certain she had been that stopping meant risking everything she had left to protect. She didn't regret it, not for a second, and she told him so, quietly, watching the last light fade behind the hills. Mason reached over and took her hand, not as a sheriff reassuring a witness, but simply as a man who had come to know exactly what kind of person she was. They drove on past the bend without stopping, the road opening up ahead of them, empty and calm, carrying them both toward whatever came next. Half a year earlier, Mason had pulled Grace onto the shoulder of that highway over nothing more than a broken taillight. He thought he was writing up a simple violation. What he actually found in that back seat was a truth an entire town had tried to bury, and a woman brave enough not to leave a stranger behind in the dark. Sometimes the smallest choice, made in the quietest hour of the night, is the one that ends up changing every life it touches.